Maya Thompson walked down the bustling aisles of the supermarket, carefully selecting items with one hand resting on her growing belly. She smiled softly, imagining the day she'd finally hold her child. Life hadn't been easy, but she had built herself up from nothing, becoming one of the most respected lawyers in the city. Every case she took on, every victory she secured, had been a testament to her strength and resilience. Maya was more than just a lawyer, she was a symbol of hope for her community, a voice for those who had none. She hummed to herself, placing a few vegetables into her cart, unaware that she was being watched. A group of police officers strolled through the supermarket, their uniforms crisp and eyes observant. At first, they had barely noticed her. Just another shopper like anyone else. But then Officer Brooks, a tall, stern-faced man with an imposing build, noticed Maya and gave her a suspicious look. Something about her made him stop and stare longer than necessary, his gaze hardening as he continued to watch her movements. It wasn't her behavior that caught his attention, it was her skin. Maya felt a chill down her spine, sensing his gaze. She'd experienced prejudice before, countless times, but she hadn't expected it here. In the safety of an ordinary grocery store, while she was carrying the most precious life inside her. She shook her head slightly, determined to ignore him, and went back to her shopping. But her quiet defiance seemed to only fuel Officer Brooks' suspicions. With a quick glance to his fellow officers, he marched toward her, his expression stern. "Ma'am," he said, his voice laced with authority, "I'm going to need to see what's in your cart." Maya looked up, taken aback. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Her instincts told her to stay calm, to avoid escalation. "There have been reports of theft around here," Brooks replied, his voice cold. "And I'd like to ensure you're not hiding anything." Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what this was. He hadn't stopped anyone else, hadn't asked to check anyone else's cart. But she kept her composure. "You're welcome to check," she replied, gesturing to her neatly arranged cart, full of only the few items she'd selected. "I have nothing to hide." But Brooks wasn't satisfied. He seemed almost disappointed at the lack of evidence, as though he had been hoping to catch her in some wrongdoing. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his voice sharp, a hint of impatience simmering underneath. Maya felt a flash of anger rise within her. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I've shown you my items. This is unnecessary." But her words only seemed to anger Brooks further. His hand moved to his belt, resting menacingly near his baton. "Don't make this difficult. Ma'am. Just cooperate." A small crowd began to gather, watching the scene unfold. Maya could feel the weight of their stares, could see the shock and pity in their eyes. Her heart ached with shame, though she'd done nothing to deserve it. She was a respected lawyer, an advocate, and a soon-to-be mother. But to this officer, she was nothing more than a suspect, a black woman to be doubted and harassed. As she took a step back, trying to reason with him, Brooks moved swiftly. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm, yanking her forward with a force that sent a jolt of pain through her body. "You're under suspicion of theft," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. Maya struggled, her mind racing with shock and disbelief. She tried to explain, to reason, but Brooks tightened his grip. The other officers joined him, blocking her from the crowd's view. In that moment, Maya felt the walls of the supermarket close in around her, trapping her in a nightmare that felt all too familiar to so many like her. "Please," she managed to gasp, her hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "I'm pregnant. You don't understand." But her words fell on deaf ears. Brooks pushed her against a shelf, the sharp edges pressing painfully into her back. She struggled to catch her breath, feeling the sharp pangs in her abdomen, the warning signs of something horribly wrong. She tried to shout, to tell them to stop, but her voice was drowned out by their commands, their demands for her submission. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the world around her seemed to blur and dim. Maya's vision swam as the pain intensified. A deep, wrenching ache that left her gasping, her heart breaking as she realized the terrible cost of this encounter. The officers didn't see her pain, didn't see her desperation, they only saw what they wanted to see. When they finally released her, Maya collapsed to the floor, her hand resting over her belly in a gesture of pure anguish. The crowd around her murmured, their faces filled with horror and sympathy. But no one dared to step forward to help. She had lost more than just her dignity that day. She had lost the life she had carried, the future she had dreamed of. As she lay there, grief consuming her, something fierce ignited within her heart. This wasn't the end. She would not let this injustice go unanswered. She was a lawyer, a fighter. And now, she had a cause that went beyond herself, a fight for her lost child. For every person who had ever been treated as less because of the color of their skin. She would make sure that this wrong would not go unpunished. And so, with a newfound resolve that burned hotter than her pain, Maya rose from the floor. She knew what she had to do. This was only the beginning. This first part sets the stage for Maya's struggle, her pain, and her resilience, capturing her strength and commitment to seek justice, not just for herself but for a greater cause. You said, "Mo wrong fan one jup twane." ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Here's an expanded version of Part 1, providing even more emotional depth, tension, and insight into Maya's thoughts and the significance of her experience. Part 1, The Unjust Encounter. Maya Thompson strolled down the aisles of the supermarket, her hand resting gently on her round belly. At 6 months pregnant, she was glowing with the joy of anticipation. Her thoughts drifted to the nursery she had yet to finish, the names she and her husband had debated over, and the life they were preparing to welcome into the world. For Maya, this child represented hope, a bridge to a brighter future, a symbol of everything she and her family had worked for. As she picked up a few fresh vegetables and carefully selected a carton of milk, Maya caught sight of a group of police officers at the entrance. Their presence was a common enough sight in her neighborhood. They patrolled regularly, supposedly to keep the peace. Still, Maya felt a pang of unease. She had grown up with a keen awareness of her place in the world, of the ways she would be seen, judged, and categorized. Even now, with her high-status profession and respect within the community, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She brushed off the unease and turned her attention back to her shopping. But her discomfort returned as she noticed one of the officers, a tall man with a square jaw and a rigid demeanor, was watching her intently. His gaze was unyielding, scrutinizing her every move. She tried to ignore him, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong. She was here just like anyone else, picking up groceries. But the longer she avoided looking at him, the closer he seemed to approach, until she could feel his shadow over her. "Ma'am," his voice broke the silence, cold and authoritative. "I need to check your cart." Maya looked up, startled but composed. She forced a polite smile, masking her irritation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone steady and respectful. "There have been some recent thefts," he replied, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "We need to be cautious." Just following protocol. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Not from fear but from the dull, familiar ache of humiliation. This wasn't about protocol, she could see it in his eyes. Sense it in the way he spoke to her. He didn't ask to see anyone else's card. Only hers. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. "You're welcome to look," she replied, gesturing to her cart. It was filled with nothing but ordinary groceries, fresh produce, bread, a few canned goods. "I have nothing to hide." But the officer, who had introduced himself as Brooks, wasn't satisfied. He seemed to look at her cart with a mixture of skepticism and disdain, as though convinced she was lying. Maya clenched her fists at her sides, feeling the familiar frustration of being assumed guilty without cause. She had seen it too many times in her line of work, had fought tirelessly to protect people like herself from such blind prejudice. Yet, here she was, on the receiving end of that same unjust scrutiny. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his tone sharper, almost daring her to resist. "Officer." "I've complied," she said, her voice more assertive now. "You've seen my items. This is unnecessary." But her words only seemed to irritate Brooks further. He glanced at the other officers, who were now watching her with matching suspicion. They encircled her, closing off her exit. She could feel the weight of their eyes, heavy and unyielding, stripping her of her dignity, her status, her very identity. In their eyes, she was no longer Maya Thompson, lawyer, soon-to-be mother. She was simply a suspect, a black woman with a target on her back. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be," Brooks said, his hand drifting to his belt. A warning in his posture. A ripple of fear ran through Maya, her hand instinctively moving to shield her belly. "Please," she said, her voice softening, the weight of her unborn child pressing on her heart. "I'm pregnant. I'm no threat to you." But Brooks' eyes flashed with something darker. He took a step forward, and Maya felt the cold metal of his baton press against her side as he gripped her arm roughly. She gasped, a wave of pain shooting through her. She tried to pull back, but his hold only tightened. A show of power meant to remind her of her place. The crowd had begun to murmur. A mix of shock and horror painted across the faces of bystanders. But no one stepped forward. No one reached out a hand to help. They watched, helplessly, their gazes a mix of pity and fear. Maya felt her cheeks burn with shame, her heart pounding with both fear and fury. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged, mistreated, or made to feel less because of the color of their skin. The pressure in her abdomen grew. A warning she couldn't ignore. "Please," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. "You're hurting me." But her words were swallowed by Brooks' commands, his voice harsh and unfeeling. "Cooperate," he barked, as though she were some unthinking animal. "Don't resist." With a final, brutal shove, he pushed her against a shelf. And Maya's vision blurred, her mind swimming as pain engulfed her. She could feel a terrible, wrenching ache, one that went deeper than her body, one that reached into the very depths of her soul. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. Her hand clutched her belly, a silent plea for mercy, for this nightmare to end. But the officers had already turned away, dismissing her suffering, indifferent to the life she had just lost. As she sank to the cold, hard floor, a void opened within her, an emptiness that no words could fill. The crowd dispersed slowly, some lingering in stunned silence, others looking away as though unable to face the reality of what they'd witnessed. Maya's hands shook as she pressed them against the floor. Her body racked with grief and rage. She felt the loss of her child like a physical wound. A raw and open scar that would never heal. This wasn't just an assault on her body, it was an assault on her dignity. Her identity. Her very existence. But as she lay there, broken and alone, something fierce ignited within her. This was not the end. She was Maya Thompson. She was a mother. A lawyer. A fighter. She would not let this injustice be swept aside. Would not let her child's death be in vain. For every wound they had inflicted. For every ounce of pain they had caused. She would make them pay. She would turn her grief into a weapon. Her sorrow into strength. She would fight. Not just for herself, but for her community. For her unborn child. For every person who had been silenced by prejudice and hatred. Maya pushed herself up. Her body trembling but her spirit unbroken. As she stood amidst the shattered pieces of her life. A promise echoed in her heart, a promise of justice. Of retribution. Of change. This was only the beginning. Maya Thompson walked through the supermarket with her hand protectively over her belly. Moving slowly and carefully between the aisles. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the future. The life she was nurturing within her. She had spent her whole career fighting for others' justice. Defending those who had no one else to stand up for them. This child was the embodiment of everything she believed in, a new generation. A fresh start. She couldn't help but smile as she imagined her future as a mother. Her heart full of warmth and dreams. For Maya. The store was just another stop on a quiet evening, a mundane errand. A momentary pause in the rhythm of her life. She pushed her cart along. Reaching for a can of tomato soup. When she noticed the faint reflection of a group of police officers in the glass doors of the freezer section. She barely gave them a second thought at first. Continuing with her shopping. Her focus drifting to her baby's first kicks and the new nursery she and her husband were setting up. But her calm began to fray when she felt a prickling sensation. The uncomfortable awareness of being watched. She turned her head slightly and saw him, Officer Brooks. He wasn't a familiar face. But his cold, scrutinizing expression was all too familiar. His gaze lingered on her with a weight she couldn't ignore. She stiffened. Recalling countless other moments in her life when she'd felt that same gaze. The one that saw her as a question mark. A suspicion. A threat. Brooks' face was unreadable. But his posture told her everything she needed to know. She could feel her stomach knotting with the bitter awareness that, despite everything she had achieved, she was still seen as someone to be doubted. Someone who didn't belong. It was a feeling that brought her back to her childhood. To moments when her parents had given her the talk about how to act around police officers. About how to make herself seem small. Non-threatening. She had been carrying these lessons her whole life. Wrapped around her like an invisible armor she never asked for. Still, Maya held her head high. She reminded herself that she was Maya Thompson. A respected attorney and a woman who had fought her way to the top of her field. She had defended countless clients. Many of whom had been victims of the same prejudices she now faced. She didn't have to justify her presence here. Didn't owe anyone an explanation for her right to exist peacefully. But Officer Brooks' gaze remained unwavering. Drilling into her with a hostility that was impossible to ignore. She felt his judgment before he even spoke. Felt the weight of every stereotype. Every bias. Pressing down on her as he walked toward her. His hand resting on his belt. "Ma'am," he said. His voice low but cutting. "Can I take a look at what you have in your cart?" The question was barely a question. It was an accusation wrapped in false courtesy. And Maya could feel her pulse quicken. She looked him straight in the eyes. holding back the swell of anger and indignation rising within her. She knew she had to keep her composure. She had fought this fight before, in courtrooms, on the streets, in her personal life. But this time, it felt different. This time, she wasn't just standing up for herself, she was standing up for her unborn child. For the family she was building. Is there a reason? Officer, she replied calmly. Her voice steady. I'm just here to buy groceries. Brooks' eyes narrowed, as if her calmness had only deepened his suspicions. We've had a few reports of theft, he replied. His voice cold and measured. And we're just doing routine checks. Maya bit back the retort on her tongue, knowing that anything she said could be twisted against her. She had learned the hard way that even the simplest words could be misinterpreted. That the system was designed to favor those in power. Instead, she gestured toward her cart, filled only with essentials, fresh fruit, bread, a carton of milk, the soup she'd picked up earlier. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that warranted this kind of treatment. You can see for yourself, she said, willing herself to stay calm. But Brooks didn't even glance at the contents of her cart. His eyes remained on her, hard and unyielding, as if he were daring her to argue. I'm going to need you to come with me. Ma'am, he said finally, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Maya felt her heart race, anger flickering into life inside her chest. She could feel her composure slipping, her resolve to stay calm wavering under the weight of his unfairness. She knew what he was doing. He was using his authority to strip her of her dignity, to remind her that no matter who she was, no matter what she had achieved, she was still, in his eyes, someone to be controlled, to be dismissed. Officer, I've shown you my items. There's no need for this, she said, her voice firm now, each word carefully measured. But her resistance only seemed to irritate him. Brooks' grip on his belt tightened, his posture stiffening as he stepped closer. Maya felt her body tense instinctively, her hand moving to shield her belly. She wanted to scream, to call out the injustice. But years of experience had taught her to stay silent, to swallow the indignities for the sake of her safety. Don't make this difficult, he growled, his voice low and menacing. Just come with me. And then, as though triggered by some unspoken challenge, he grabbed her arm, his grip ironclad. Maya gasped, feeling a sharp jolt of pain. Panic surged within her, her instincts screaming at her to pull away, to protect herself and her child. She tried to shake free, tried to explain, but his hold only tightened, his strength overpowering her. It was a display of power she recognized all too well, a reminder of who held control and who was expected to submit. The crowd around them had grown, faces painted with shock and horror as they watched the scene unfold. Some looked on in sympathy, others in helplessness. But none dared to step forward, to challenge the authority bearing down on her. She was alone, trapped under the weight of Brooks' hold and the silence of those around her. Please, she managed to whisper, her voice cracking under the strain. I'm pregnant. You're hurting me. But her words seemed to bounce off him, absorbed by the callous indifference in his gaze. To him, her pain was irrelevant, her pleas mere noise. He was focused on his power, on maintaining his authority over her, on reducing her to nothing more than a suspect, a target. With a brutal shove, he pushed her against the metal shelves. The impact sent a searing pain through her back, and she felt a wave of nausea roll over her. The ache in her belly intensified, a deep, wrenching pain that clawed at her insides. She could feel something terrible happening, a sensation she couldn't fully comprehend but instinctively knew was wrong. Devastatingly wrong. Her vision blurred as she sank to the floor. Her hand pressed to her belly in a futile attempt to protect the life she had carried with so much love and hope. The crowd blurred in her periphery. Their faces a blend of horror, pity, and guilt. But no one moved. No one helped. When Brooks finally released her, she lay there, broken and devastated. Her body racked with pain and her heart shattered. She felt the loss as a hollow ache that echoed through her entire being. A wound that went beyond the physical. She had lost more than just her dignity. More than her pride. She had lost her child. Her future. Her hope. And yet, in that hollow space where her heart had once been, something fierce and unbreakable began to grow. This was not the end. This was the beginning of a fight she would not abandon. For herself. For her lost child. And for every other person who had ever been crushed beneath the weight of injustice. As she rose, trembling but resolute, Maya knew one thing for certain: she would not rest until justice was served. Until those responsible were held accountable. This was only the beginning of her story. A story of resilience. Of justice. Of a mother's love turned into unstoppable resolve. Maya lay in a hospital bed. The harsh fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the room. The nurses had been gentle. The doctors compassionate. But there was no consolation they could offer that would ease the emptiness within her. She had lost her child, her precious, innocent child, because of a moment's blind hatred. The thought burned within her, filling the hollow space left by her grief with a determination stronger than steel. She wasn't just a grieving mother, she was a lawyer. A fighter. And she would find justice. No matter how long it took or how many walls she had to tear down to get there. The days that followed were a blur of pain and resolve. As Maya recovered, her mind began working like a clock. Gears turning as she planned her next steps. She spent long, sleepless nights reviewing case files, drawing on every ounce of her legal expertise to construct her case. She knew the law inside and out, she had built her life on it. Devoted herself to defending the innocent and protecting the vulnerable. Now, she would turn that knowledge against the very system she once trusted. Her first step was to gather evidence. Maya returned to the supermarket, walking down the same aisle she had been in on that terrible day. Her heart pounded as memories flooded back. But she pushed through, determined not to let fear deter her. She spoke with the store manager, requesting access to the surveillance footage. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. But Maya's unwavering gaze and her reputation as a respected attorney left him with little choice. The tapes were handed over. And as Maya watched the footage, anger simmered beneath her calm exterior. There it was, clear. Undeniable evidence of Officer Brooks' aggression and her innocence. The footage showed her simply shopping, followed by Brooks' unjustified assault. A brutal act without cause or justification. But she needed more than just video evidence. She needed witnesses. She tracked down several people who had been in the store that day, approaching them with both professionalism and vulnerability. Some were reluctant to speak, fearing repercussions, while others were eager to help. Their own indignation ignited by the injustice they had witnessed. Each account added weight to her case, painting a picture of racial profiling, of unchecked authority and abuse of power. As she built her case, Maya felt a weight pressing down on her. She was not only fighting for herself and her lost child but for something larger. Something that had plagued her community for generations. She thought of her parents, who had warned her about the dangers of prejudice, who had taught her how to survive in a world that viewed her as different, as lesser. She thought of the countless clients she had represented, men and women who had been victims of similar discrimination. People whose stories often went unheard. For them. For her family. For her lost child. Maya knew she couldn't back down. The day she filed the lawsuit, the city was abuzz with whispers. News spread quickly that Maya Thompson, the city's most well-regarded attorney, was suing the police department for racial profiling and wrongful assault. It was unprecedented. No one had ever taken on the city's law enforcement with such confidence. But Maya was relentless. Undeterred by the daunting odds, the city's police department was a fortress, seemingly impenetrable, guarded by layers of bureaucracy, political influence, and long-standing tradition. But Maya knew that even the mightiest walls could crumble with enough pressure. The police department responded swiftly, denying all accusations. They issued statements dismissing Maya's claims, painting Officer Brooks as a respectable officer who had acted within his rights. They framed her actions as an overreaction and an attempt to tarnish the department's reputation. Maya's fury only grew as she read their statements. The lies so blatant, the lack of accountability so glaring. She could see the cracks in their defenses, and she was ready to pry them wide open. Days turned into weeks, and the city braced itself as Maya's case moved toward trial. The tension was palpable, a current of anticipation and fear running through every corner of the city. People took sides, some condemning Maya as a troublemaker, others rallying around her as a beacon of courage and truth. She became a symbol, her face appearing on news broadcasts, her story a topic of conversation in homes and businesses alike. And though the scrutiny was overwhelming, though the pressure sometimes felt unbearable, Maya held her head high, driven by the memory of the child she had lost. The night before the trial, Maya sat alone in her office, surrounded by stacks of evidence, witness statements, and legal texts. She could feel the weight of what lay ahead, the burden of representing not only herself but an entire community that had long been silenced. She closed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her, and took a deep breath. In that moment, she felt a strange calm wash over her, as though the spirit of her child was with her, guiding her, giving her strength. This was her purpose, her calling. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial, every seat filled with spectators, journalists, and supporters. The atmosphere was tense, electric. As Maya took her place at the front of the room, she felt the eyes of the jury on her, saw the determined faces of her witnesses, and sensed the silent, watchful presence of her community behind her. The opening arguments were tense, the prosecution painting Maya as a radical seeking attention, dismissing her pain and framing her as an instigator. But Maya was undeterred. When it was her turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady and unwavering as she recounted the events of that night, her words carrying the weight of her grief and her resolve. She spoke of her loss, of the fear and humiliation she had endured, but also of her strength, her love for her child, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Witness after witness testified, each one adding another piece to the puzzle, another layer to the truth. Some spoke of Brooks' reputation for aggressive behavior. Others recalled the brutality they had witnessed that day in the supermarket. The surveillance footage was played, filling the room with a heavy silence as the jury watched the scene unfold. The unjust aggression, the loss of innocence. By the time the video ended, there was no denying the truth. As the days went on, the defense tried every tactic to discredit her, to cast doubt on her character. They brought up her past, her cases, trying to paint her as an ambitious woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. But Maya met each accusation head-on, her answers clear, her resolve unshakable. She knew they were trying to break her, to push her into silence. But they had underestimated her. They had underestimated the depth of her love, the strength of her spirit, In her closing argument, Maya spoke directly to the jury. Her voice filled with a fierce, unbreakable resolve. "This case is not just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "It's about justice. It's about holding those in power accountable. About saying enough to the prejudice that has plagued our society for too long. I am not here to seek revenge. I am here to seek justice. For my child. For myself. And for every person who has ever been made to feel less because of the color of their skin. We all deserve to live in a world where justice is real. Where those who are sworn to protect us do so without bias or hatred." As she finished, the courtroom was silent, her words hanging in the air. A call to action. A demand for change. Maya returned to her seat, her heart pounding, her spirit resolute. She had done everything she could. Now it was in the hands of the jury. When the verdict was finally announced, a hush fell over the room. As the words "guilty" echoed through the courtroom, a wave of relief and triumph washed over her. Tears filled her eyes. Not just for herself, but for her child. For her community. For everyone who had fought and struggled for justice. Maya left the courtroom that day with her head held high. Her heart filled with a sense of purpose and healing. Her battle was far from over. But she had taken the first step in a journey that would change lives. That would challenge the system. That would demand accountability. She was more than a survivor, she was a symbol. A voice for the voiceless. A warrior for justice. And in her heart, she knew her child's spirit lived on. Guiding her. Fueling her fight for a world where justice was not a privilege, but a right for all. As the city buzzed with news of Maya's lawsuit against the police department, she found herself moving through her days in a surreal haze. Balancing her intense grief with an unshakable resolve. The pain of losing her child was with her in every breath. Every heartbeat. Yet she knew she couldn't let it break her. She had chosen her path. And there was no turning back. The people in her community looked to her as a beacon of hope. And Maya would do everything in her power to honor that trust. Every morning, she would rise before dawn, her mind already racing with thoughts of her case. She was meticulous in her preparation, spending hours combing through police records, gathering evidence, and piecing together a timeline that would prove not only the officer's guilt but also the broader pattern of racial profiling that had plagued her community for years. The police department's lawyers had already started an aggressive campaign, twisting her intentions, painting her as a radical who sought to disrupt public peace. Maya knew their tactics well, she had faced such tactics on behalf of her clients before. But now, it was her own life and reputation under attack. Despite her inner strength, there were nights when the weight of it all became nearly unbearable. In the quiet hours, Maya would sit alone, her thoughts drifting to her lost child. And her heart would ache with a sorrow so deep she could hardly breathe. She found herself talking to her child, whispering promises, as if the baby could somehow hear her, as if she could share her plans and the justice she hoped to achieve. "This is for you," she would murmur into the darkness, her voice breaking. "I will make this right. I promise." She reached out to leaders in her community, pastors, activists, mothers who had lost children to the system's cruelty. They shared their stories, their anger, their resilience. They, too, were tired of living under the shadow of fear and prejudice. And they encouraged Maya to keep fighting, to bring their voices into the courtroom with her. These connections fortified her, grounding her in a sense of shared purpose that extended beyond her own tragedy. She knew that this case, her fight, was more than just a battle for personal justice. It was a stand against a system that had oppressed her people for far too long. But as her case progressed, the stakes grew higher. The police department mounted a ruthless defense, using every tool at their disposal to discredit her. They dredged up details of her personal life, questioning her relationships, her career choices. Anything they could twist into a narrative that would paint her as unstable, as unfit to take on the department. They spun her grief into a story of over-emotionality, suggesting that she was unhinged, that her sorrow had clouded her judgment. It was a tactic she had seen used against countless women, countless black women in particular. But now, it was directed at her, and she felt the sting of it more deeply than she could have ever imagined. There were moments when she could barely contain her anger, when she wanted to stand up and shout, to expose their lies. But she had to be smart. She knew she couldn't afford to lose control. Every step of this battle required strategy and focus, and she wasn't about to let their taunts derail her. One night, as Maya was preparing for the upcoming trial, she received an unexpected visitor at her office. An older man, with deep-set lines on his face and eyes that had seen too much, introduced himself as Pastor Daniels. He was a leader in her community, a man whose sermons had inspired generations to stand strong in the face of injustice. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and looked her in the eyes, his expression filled with a wisdom born of struggle. "Maya," he said softly, "you're not alone in this. Remember that. This fight, it's not just yours to bear. We are with you, every step of the way." His words resonated within her, filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that she was not just fighting for herself or even for her child. She was fighting for her community, for people like Pastor Daniels, for the young men and women who looked up to her, who needed to know that justice was possible. In the days leading up to the trial, Maya's presence in the media grew. Reporters hounded her for statements, twisting her words, framing her as a controversial figure, as someone seeking attention rather than justice. But with each interview, she remained composed, refusing to let them define her story. She spoke of her child, of the love she had carried within her, and of the pain that had been inflicted upon her by the very people who were meant to protect her. Her words were measured, but her passion was unmistakable, and it resonated deeply with those who had experienced similar injustices. The trial began on a rainy morning, the sky dark and heavy as though reflecting the weight of what was to come. Maya walked into the courthouse, flanked by her attorney and her family, feeling the eyes of the crowd upon her. The courtroom was filled with supporters, friends, strangers who had been moved by her story, as well as opponents, people who clung to their beliefs in the infallibility of the police. The tension was palpable, and Maya could feel her heart pounding as she took her place at the front of the room. The prosecutor wasted no time, immediately painting Officer Brooks as an honorable man who had simply been doing his duty. They showed pictures of Brooks with his family, cited his years of service, his commendations. They sought to make him appear as a pillar of the community, a good man who had been unjustly accused. Maya felt a surge of frustration as she watched the jury absorb this narrative, knowing that they were trying to appeal to the biases that had led to this very case. But when it was her turn, Maya stood before the jury, her voice steady and clear, her gaze unwavering. She spoke of that night in the supermarket, her tone carrying the weight of her grief, the dignity of her loss. She spoke of the life she had lost, the dreams that had been shattered in an instant of unwarranted aggression. Her words cut through the courtroom like a knife, each sentence charged with the raw truth of her experience. Witness after witness came forward to testify, recounting the events they had witnessed, the brutality they had seen. The surveillance footage played for the court, a damning testament to the injustice she had endured. As the video played, the room was silent, the horror of that night displayed for all to see. The jurors' faces were tense, their eyes fixed on the screen, Unable to deny the truth before them, the defense attempted to challenge her character, to paint her as an angry woman seeking revenge. They brought up her history, her cases, her advocacy for her community, twisting her passion into a narrative of instability. But Maya met each accusation with grace and strength, turning their attempts to vilify her into further proof of the prejudice she had been fighting against her entire life. In her closing argument, Maya spoke not just of her own loss but of the loss endured by countless others, of the pain that ran through her community like an open wound. "This case is not just about me," she said, her voice breaking but her spirit unyielding. "It is about every mother who has had to explain to her children why they are treated differently. Every father who has feared for his child's safety. Every person who has felt the sting of prejudice and the weight of injustice. I am here today because I believe in a world where justice is real, where love and compassion outweigh hatred and bias. And I hope that, by the end of this trial, you will believe in that world too." As she spoke, the courtroom was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. She had poured her heart into her fight, her love for her child into her words. When she finished, a ripple of quiet admiration passed through the room, the impact of her story resonating in the eyes of the jurors, the spectators, and even the judge. When the jury finally returned with the verdict, the tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. As the foreman read the word guilty, a wave of relief and triumph washed over her. She had won. Not just for herself, but for her child, for her community, for every person who had ever been silenced by prejudice. Justice had been served, and a powerful message had been sent. Maya left the courtroom that day feeling both exhausted and uplifted, knowing that her fight had made a difference. She had transformed her grief into strength, her pain into purpose, and in doing so, had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope. The memory of her child would live on, not as a loss, but as the driving force behind a movement for justice, equality, and change. When Maya left the courthouse after the verdict, the world outside felt different, heavy, electric, as if the air itself carried the weight of her victory. Her family and close friends embraced her, their faces tear-streaked but smiling, their joy a quiet contrast to the city around them. Supporters lined the steps of the courthouse, some cheering, others raising signs in solidarity. Her victory wasn't just hers, it was theirs too. They saw in her fight the echoes of their own struggles, a symbol that, for once, justice had favored the oppressed over the powerful. Maya's relief, however, was bittersweet. She had won. Yes. But the hole in her heart, the grief for her lost child, remained as raw as ever. The child she had never met, yet whom she loved fiercely, was gone. A life stolen by blind prejudice. But as she looked into the eyes of the people gathered around her, young and old, strangers and friends, she realized that her child's memory had become something more. In her loss, she had found purpose. And in her purpose, her child would live on. The following days were a whirlwind. Reporters and activists requested interviews, and her phone didn't stop buzzing with messages of support and gratitude. The story of her case spread like wildfire, igniting conversations across the country about racial profiling, police accountability, and justice for marginalized communities. Maya had always been known in her city, but now, her name was spoken far beyond its borders. She found herself standing at the heart of a movement that seemed to grow by the day. But with the fame came an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Her victory had given hope to people across the nation. But she knew that one case wouldn't be enough to change a system. Her victory was a spark. Yes. But it needed to be nurtured into a flame. As she sat in her office, Surrounded by stacks of letters from supporters and case files of others who had been wronged, Maya felt a new calling rise within her. She had become a voice for the voiceless. And she could not walk away now. One afternoon, while meeting with a group of activists in her office, she was approached by Sarah Chang, a young woman whose brother had died in police custody a year prior. Sarah's story was hauntingly similar to Maya's own experience, the same lack of accountability, the same dismissal of human life. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she explained her frustration, her anger, her fear that her brother's death would be forgotten. "Maya," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I'll ever see justice for my brother. But seeing you fight, seeing you win, it gives me hope. Maybe I can keep going. Maybe I can make them hear me too." Maya felt her heart ache as she listened to Sarah's story, her own grief merging with Sarah's in a shared understanding of loss and resilience. She took Sarah's hands in hers and looked her in the eyes. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "We'll fight together. For your brother. For my child. And for everyone who has been hurt by this system." The next few months became a relentless pursuit of justice. Not just for Sarah, but for others who began to come forward, each with their own stories of pain, discrimination, and loss. Maya took on case after case, advocating for those who had been silenced, using her growing influence to demand change within the city's legal system. Her voice echoed through City Hall, her words inspiring protests, discussions, and calls for reform. She became a force to be reckoned with, respected and feared by those in power. Yet, as the months wore on, the exhaustion began to take its toll. Maya was a warrior, but even warriors needed rest. Her grief, once a fire driving her forward, now lay simmering beneath the surface. A quiet sadness that weighed on her every step. Late at night, alone in her empty home, she would sit with her thoughts, the echoes of her loss filling the silence. She would think of her child, of the life that had been stolen from her, and the ache in her heart would feel as fresh as the day she'd lost them. One evening, unable to sleep, Maya found herself returning to the hospital where she had spent those first days after her loss. She walked the sterile, quiet halls, memories flooding back, each step heavier than the last. Eventually, she found herself standing in front of the maternity ward, watching through the glass as new mothers held their babies, cradling them with love and joy. She felt a tear slide down her cheek, the sharp sting of longing twisting within her. But as she stood there, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Pastor Daniels, the same man who had visited her before her trial, his face soft with understanding. "Sometimes," he said gently, "we have to carry our pain with us. Let it shape us, but not let it consume us. Your fight has given meaning to your loss, Maya. But you have to take care of yourself too." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She knew he was right. She had been so focused on fighting, on honoring her child's memory, that she had neglected her own healing. But how could she pause now, with so many people depending on her? Pastor Daniels seemed to sense her turmoil. "Your child's spirit is with you, Maya," he said softly. "And they would want you to find peace. Sometimes, the greatest strength comes from allowing ourselves to heal." In the days that followed, Maya took his words to heart. She began making small changes, carving out moments of quiet, reconnecting with her family and friends, allowing herself to laugh, to feel joy again. Her work was still important, her fight still vital. But she started to find a balance. She poured her love for her child into every case she took. But she also allowed herself to feel, to grieve, to live. With time, her efforts led to tangible changes. The police department instituted new policies aimed at preventing racial profiling and ensuring accountability for officers. Her cases began setting precedents, paving the way for others to seek justice without fear of retribution. Maya was approached by city officials, eager to have her voice in committees. Her perspective in decision-making rooms that had been closed to her community for so long. Maya's work extended beyond the courtroom and the city. She started a foundation in her child's name, dedicated to supporting families who had been impacted by police violence and discrimination. The foundation provided legal resources, counseling, and advocacy, a beacon of hope for those who had nowhere else to turn. Through her work, Maya's child's memory became a legacy, a light for those lost in the darkness of grief and injustice. Years passed, and Maya's influence continued to grow. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and met with leaders across the country. Her story was told in classrooms, in homes, in courtrooms, a reminder of the power of resilience, of love, of justice. She had become more than just a lawyer. More than a mother, she was a symbol of change, a living testament to the strength that could be found in the darkest moments. And yet, every night, before she went to sleep, she would sit quietly and think of her child. She would close her eyes and whisper a promise, a vow that she would never stop fighting for a better world. A world where no one would have to suffer as she had. Her grief had become her strength, her love a guiding light. And in her heart, she knew her child was with her, watching, proud of the change their life had inspired. Maya's journey was far from over. The fight for justice would continue, the struggle for equality unending. But she had found her purpose, her calling. And in that purpose, she had found healing. Her child's memory had become a force for good, a reminder that even the greatest pain could be transformed into something beautiful. Something lasting. Several years had passed since Maya's landmark case against the police department. And the city had changed. The laws had changed. Maya had become not just a lawyer, but a voice for justice. A relentless force that had altered the landscape of accountability and equality in her community. She was no longer simply an attorney fighting individual battles. She was a leader inspiring others to rise up and demand a fairer, more compassionate world. But even as Maya grew in prominence and influence, the struggle continued. She took on case after case, each one a battle against the deeply ingrained biases and injustices that still plagued the system. She was often weary, her days long and grueling, her nights a balancing act between exhaustion and resolve. But each case reminded her of her purpose. Each fight a reaffirmation of her promise to her child, a promise that their legacy would live on. That no one would forget the sacrifice made. The injustice endured. As Maya's foundation expanded, so did her reach. Families across the country reached out to her, seeking justice, comfort, guidance. Her foundation grew into a beacon for victims of police violence, providing resources and legal aid, support groups, and scholarships. She had gathered a team of passionate lawyers, counselors, and activists, all of whom shared her mission to make the world a safer, more just place for future generations. One day, as Maya was organizing case files in her office, she received a letter that struck her profoundly. It was from a young girl named Leah, who wrote about her father's death in an incident involving law enforcement. Leah's words were filled with sadness and anger, but also with admiration for Maya's courage. She shared how Maya's story had inspired her to pursue a career in law, to one day fight for people like her father and make sure his memory wasn't lost. Maya's heart ached as she read Leah's letter, but she also felt a renewed sense of hope. This young girl's words reminded her why she had chosen this path. Why she continued to fight despite the endless challenges. Maya wrote back, sharing words of encouragement, promising Leah that one day she could be a part of the change they both dreamed of. And as Maya sent the letter, she knew that her child's legacy was alive in each of the lives she touched, each of the futures she helped shape. The next few months brought Maya one of her most difficult cases. A mother whose son had died during an arrest came to Maya, desperate for justice. The case was complex, the circumstances muddy, and the opposing side was powerful, with deep connections and resources that threatened to bury the truth. But Maya took the case, driven by the memory of her own loss and by the knowledge that this mother's pain mirrored her own. The trial was grueling, filled with intense questioning, manipulation, and attempts to twist the truth. Maya found herself in a courtroom facing a wall of lawyers determined to discredit her client and erase her son's memory. But Maya met each challenge head-on. Her words a fierce, unbreakable current of truth and passion. She laid out the evidence, calling out the bias that had fueled the tragedy, exposing the cracks in the system with precision and eloquence. She felt her heart beating fiercely, her child's memory a steady rhythm guiding her forward. As the trial reached its climax, Maya delivered a closing argument that would be remembered long after the case was closed. She spoke directly to the jury, her voice filled with a power and vulnerability that silenced the room. "Injustice doesn't live in shadows," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "It hides in plain sight. In our laws. In our assumptions. In our indifference. But today, we have a choice to do better. We have a chance to bring light into the darkness. To create a world where no mother has to bury her child because of fear and hatred." The jury deliberated for hours, each minute a stretch of tense silence. When they returned, Maya held her breath, her heart pounding as she awaited the verdict. As the foreman read the words guilty, a ripple of relief spread through the room, filling it with a sense of triumph, of justice finally served. The mother embraced Maya with tears of gratitude, her face filled with the bittersweet pain of victory. Maya held her, the two women united by their shared loss, by the knowledge that they had both fought for something greater than themselves. In that moment, Maya felt a sense of peace settle within her. She had done right by her child's memory. She had turned her grief into action, her loss into change. As the years went on, Maya continued her work, but with a newfound balance in her life. She had learned the importance of nurturing her own soul, of finding moments of rest and joy amid the fight. She spent more time with her family, rekindled old friendships, and even allowed herself to fall in love again. Her life was rich with purpose and connection. And though the pain of her loss never left her, it became a quiet, steady presence, a reminder of her strength and resilience. Eventually, Maya began to mentor young lawyers, sharing her experiences, her knowledge, her passion. She spoke in universities, at conferences, in community centers, her words inspiring countless others to stand up against injustice, to find courage in their struggles. Her foundation grew, reaching people across the nation, each new case a testament to her child's legacy, a reminder of the promise she had made to build a world where justice was not just a dream but a reality. In her final years, Maya was invited to speak at a national summit on justice reform. She stood before an audience of young activists, advocates, and lawyers, her hair streaked with gray, her presence calm and commanding. She looked out at the faces before her, the future changemakers, and felt a surge of hope. The torch she had carried was now in their hands. Maya shared her journey, her voice a blend of wisdom and humility. She spoke of the battles won, the lives touched, the lessons learned. And in her closing words, she left them with a piece of her soul. A truth she had discovered through a lifetime of struggle and resilience. "We are all called to carry a part of the world's pain," she said. Her voice strong but gentle. But we are also called to transform that pain into love, into justice, into change. Remember that your journey, no matter how painful, can become someone else's hope. Never underestimate the power of your voice, of your courage. And know that each of you has the potential to make this world a little kinder, a little fairer, a little brighter. As she left the stage, the room erupted in applause. A standing ovation that filled her heart with warmth. She felt her child's presence. A comforting warmth. As if they, too, were proud of the legacy she had built in their memory. In the end, Maya had become more than just a lawyer. More than just a fighter. She had become a symbol of resilience. A testament to the strength found in love, in grief, in justice. Her child's legacy lived on, woven into the lives of those she had touched. A reminder that even in the face of the deepest loss, one could create a legacy of hope, compassion, and transformation. Maya Thompson, a highly respected lawyer and a soon-to-be mother, experiences a tragic loss when she is wrongfully detained and assaulted by racially biased police officers in a grocery store, leading to the miscarriage of her child. Overwhelmed by grief but fueled by a fierce sense of justice, Maya decides to take legal action against the police department, determined to seek accountability for herself, her unborn child, and her community, which has long suffered from discrimination. As she prepares for her case, Maya faces immense personal and professional challenges. The police department uses all its resources to discredit her, painting her as a radical. But Maya perseveres, building her case with undeniable evidence and the support of witnesses who had seen the brutal incident. Her community rallies behind her, and she becomes a symbol of resilience and courage, standing up not only for herself but for all those who have been silenced by systemic prejudice. When her case finally goes to trial, Maya's powerful testimony and relentless pursuit of truth expose the police department's misconduct. The jury delivers a guilty verdict, marking a landmark victory that reverberates throughout the city and beyond. Maya's win ignites a national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability, inspiring many to share their stories and seek justice. However, her journey doesn't end with the trial. Moved by the people who continue to come to her for support, she establishes a foundation in her child's memory, dedicated to providing legal assistance and resources for victims of police violence. As years pass, Maya's foundation grows, reaching across the country and impacting countless lives. She mentors young lawyers, advocates for justice reform, and works to create a more just world. Her story inspires a new generation of activists and changemakers, including Leah, a young girl who lost her father to police violence and is now determined to become a lawyer herself. Maya's life becomes a legacy of transformation, her work woven into the fabric of her community and beyond. In her later years, Maya speaks at a national summit, sharing her journey and reminding her audience that true justice comes from turning pain into purpose. She leaves them with words of hope and courage, encouraging each of them to use their struggles as a force for good. As Maya steps off the stage to a standing ovation, she feels a quiet sense of peace. She knows that her child's memory lives on, not just in her heart, but in every life she's touched, every voice she's empowered, every step toward justice her work has inspired. Her loss has become a legacy, a beacon of hope and compassion for generations to come. Maya had transformed her grief into a lifetime of change, proving that even in the face of the deepest pain, love and justice could prevail. In her heart, She knows that she has kept her promise to her child, to build a world where justice is a reality for all. And where no one's voice goes unheard.